I nearly dropped my phone when Mr. Jensen's frantic voice crackled through the line, delivering news that hit like a punch to the gut. "They tore down your barn, Martin. Half of it's gone." My heart seized. That barn wasn't just wood and nails. It was a century-old heirloom built in 1925 by my great-grandfather with salvaged timber from a defunct sawmill, a testament to my family's roots in Willow Peak. I'm Martin Driscoll, 50, volunteer firefighter, born and bred here, living on land my wife Shannon and I inherited after my dad passed a decade ago. We ran a small hobby farm, goats, and orchard, a nod to local history with that barn's wide doors and A-frame roof drawing visitors for photos. Most neighbors loved it, but Virginia Hamilton, the Willow Peak HOA president, dubbed HOA Karen in local whispers, saw it as a blemish on her pristine suburban dream. She nagged us for years with petty notices about chipped paint or hidden livestock, but I'd shrugged her off. Now she'd gone nuclear, ordering a demolition crew to rip it apart. I sped home, adrenaline roaring, expecting a county crew with permits. Instead, I found a gutted shell, the barn's front facade in splinters, timbers jutting like broken bones. Mr. Jensen wrung his hands at the fence line. "They came with a backhoe this morning, said the HOA called it a condemned hazard. I tried to stop them, but they threatened the sheriff." I felt nauseous, the smell of sawdust and old wood thick in the air. This wasn't just destruction, it was a violation, personal and raw. Why me? Because I'd never joined her precious HOA. What gave her the guts to touch private land? I called the sheriff. A deputy arrived, eyeing the wreckage with confusion. "This is your property. HOA's got no say here without a county condemnation," he said. No such order existed, he confirmed. I'd never gotten a notice. If Virginia acted alone, this was vandalism, maybe worse. "File a report," he advised, "but it might be civil court, not cuffs." Fine, I thought. If that's what it took, I'd fight. Shannon got home that evening, her face draining as she saw the barn's skeleton under the twilight. We dreamed of turning it into an event space or workshop, a future now shattered. She teared up, and I felt the weight of our legacy crumbling with it. The next day, I stormed the HOA office, a slick brick building with manicured hedges and glass doors. Virginia emerged, blonde, bob perfect, smile smug. "Martin," she cooed, "I'm sorry about the barn, but it was a hazard, structurally unsound, a risk to the community." I clenched my jaw. "Protect what? It stood 100 years with no trouble. You had no right to trespass and destroy it." She shrugged. "Our inspection team deemed it unsafe, leaning a danger to kids or passers-by." "No county notice, no inspection," I shot back. "It's not even in your boundaries." Her mask slipped slightly. "Our updated map includes adjacent corridors. Perhaps you missed it. File a complaint if you must, but it was for safety." The gall, she'd redrawn lines to snag my land without a word. Rage and grief churned as I slammed out, vowing she'd pay. I called Bruce Keller, an attorney friend recommended for HOA battles, a wiry guy with sharp eyes and sharper legal chops. "If they had no authority, Martin, this is big trespass, destruction, maybe punitive damages for malice," he said. We had no demolition notices, just old gripes about paint. "Gather evidence," he urged. Photos, witnesses, timelines. Virginia thought she'd bulldoze me into silence, but she'd picked the wrong guy. The days after Virginia Hamilton's crew gutted my barn were a blur of fury and focus, my resolve hardening with every splinter I saw scattered across my land. That barn, built by my great-grandfather in 1925, a survivor of wars and storms, wasn't just a structure. It was Driscoll history, and she'd slashed it in half like it was nothing. I, Martin Driscoll, wasn't about to let her smug, safety excuse bury the truth. Bruce Keller, my attorney, was already mapping our fight. Trespass, property destruction, maybe a malice angle if we could prove it. "We need ammo," he said. "Photos, statements, anything showing the barn was solid and they had no right." I dove in, pulling my father's deed to confirm our boundaries, digging up recent pics of the barn's sturdy frame, and getting Mr. Jensen to notarize his account of the backhoe blitz. The HOA's gall didn't stop there. A letter arrived, fancy seal and all, demanding I pay $14,000 for administrative fees to cover their demolition. I stared, disbelief morphing into a dark laugh. Bruce grinned when I showed him. "They're burying themselves, let's sue." Word spread fast in Willow Peak, and I wasn't alone in my grudge. Neighbors whispered their own HOA horror stories, fines for wrong paint, threats over sheds, scared silent by Virginia's rumored county connections. My barn, though, was the breaking point. Some thanked me quietly for standing up, their relief palpable. Bruce hit gold with the county inspector's office. A report from 3 years back called the barn surprisingly sound, needing only minor fixes, no condemnation ever. That was our ace, proof her hazard claim was a lie. We filed in county court trespass, conversion, damages soaring past 6 figures with the barn's historical weight. Bruce pushed for punitive damages, too. HOAs bully because folks don't fight, he said. One big loss can cripple them. Days later, Virginia called a special board meeting, summoning me to settle. Bruce tagged along, warning, "It's a trap, don't agree to anything." I braced for her next move. The meeting was in their polished HQ, a conference room of potted plants and stiff board members eyeing me like I'd torched their lawns. Virginia sat at the head, blazer crisp, confidence unshaken. "We'd like this handled amicably," she began, voice smooth. "The demolition was necessary, we thought we had an easement, believed the barn was a hazard." I snorted. "Where's the condemnation, the notice?" She pursed her lips. "We moved quickly for safety." "And billing me $14,000 for your vandalism?" I shot back. A beige-suited guy mumbled about resident complaints, but no proof surfaced, just bluff. Bruce stepped in, sliding out photos, inspection records, our deed. "You demolished a historic structure on private land without authority, then billed him for it. That's not a misunderstanding, it's liability." Silence hit hard. Virginia pivoted, offering a few grand and an apology. "Let's keep it simple, Martin. We'll pay a reasonable value," Bruce countered. "Its value isn't just lumber, it's heritage, cultural weight, emotional toll. We're not settling cheap." Murmurs rippled. One woman whispered, "We can't afford that." Another fretted about insurance dropping them. Virginia's mask cracked, but she dug in. "See you in court," she snapped as we left. My palms sweated, trial loomed large, but letting her skate wasn't an option. Depositions kicked off. We subpoenaed HOA emails, hunting for malice. Their lawyer painted me as negligent, flashing blurry, leaning wall pics, post-demolition fakes, Bruce argued, countered by our clear pre-destruction shots. Allies emerged. The local historical societies, Miss Penrose, brought postcards and pamphlets proving the barn's landmark status, ready to testify. A neighbor history teacher recalled school trips there. Virginia thought she'd crush me, but she'd lit a fire, and I was stoking it with every shred of evidence I could find. The fight for my barn's justice gained steam as spring edged closer, every step fueled by the memory of its splintered remains and Virginia Hamilton's smug audacity. I, Martin Driscoll, was knee-deep in a war against the Willow Peak HOA, and the stakes kept climbing. Bruce Keller, my attorney, was relentless. Our lawsuit alleged trespass, conversion, and a hefty damages claim, bolstered by the barn's near-century of history. Depositions were a slog. The HOA's lawyer slung mud, claiming the barn was a collapse waiting to happen, flashing grainy photos of a leaning wall that Bruce shredded as post-demolition distortions. We fired back with pristine shots from a real estate listing, the barn tall and true, plus the county's 3-year-old report calling it sound. Then Bruce struck gold. An email chain between Virginia and the demolition contractor. "Tear down that barn ASAP. It's making our community look rundown. Don't worry about owner's consent. We'll handle it." My pulse raced. This wasn't a mistake. It was malice, a silver bullet for punitive damages. Willow Peak buzzed with the case. Neighbors, once cowed by Virginia's rumored county ties, crept out with tales of HOA overreach, fines for doorknobs, trashed sheds, forced landscaping bills. They feared her clout, but my stand lit a spark. Some offered quiet nods, others moral support, grateful someone was swinging back. The local historical society rallied hard. Miss Penrose brought a trove of postcards, photos, and a pamphlet hailing the barn as a rural icon, pledging to testify. A high school history teacher joined, recalling student field trips to its creaking beams. The press caught wind, too. Reporters hovered, sniffing a small-town hero versus HOA bully headline. Trial loomed in late spring, tension thick as we filed into the county courthouse. Virginia strode in, icy and poised, but I caught flickers of doubt in her eyes. Opening statements set the stage. We laid out the trespass, the email's venom, the lack of legal ground. Their side clung to a flimsy, good-faith safety tale that felt hollow against our stack of proof. Witnesses piled on. Mr. Jensen recounted the backhoe assault, voice shaking as he described Virginia's crew brushing off his pleas. The demolition boss squirmed under oath, admitting she'd claimed an official notice existed. He'd never seen it, just trusted her word. The county inspector's record sealed it. The barn was stable, no condemnation ever issued. The HOA trotted out a shaky structural engineer muttering about potential rot, but no pre-demolition inspection backed him. Then Virginia took the stand, cool as steel. Bruce grilled her on the email. "What? Don't worry about consent, mean?" She brushed it off as casual phrasing, insisting the barn was an eyesore based on resident calls, yet no logs, no letters, nothing but her say-so surfaced. The judge's frown deepened. Her story was unraveling. Closing arguments hit hard. Bruce wove the barn's legacy, its cultural heft, the HOA's reckless power grab. Their lawyers' hazard spiel rang thin, a desperate echo against the email's stark intent. Outside, reporters swarmed, mics thrust forward as I waited for the verdict, nerves churning. A week later, we reconvened. The judge's voice was steady, slicing through each point. Private property, no condemnation, HOA overreach, malicious intent via email. He awarded compensatory damages, tens of thousands for the barn's appraised worth, historical value included, then piled on punitive damages to deter such misconduct, a sum that could gut the HOA if insurance balked. Shannon's grip bruised my arm. I exhaled, relief crashing in. Virginia sat ashen, board members gaping. The gavel banged, and I stepped into a flurry of flashes. Justice wasn't the barn back, but it was a hammer blow to Virginia's tyranny, and I'd swung it true. The courtroom's echo faded as the judge's gavel sealed Virginia Hamilton's fate, but the fallout from that verdict was just igniting in Willow Peak. Martin Driscoll, stood outside, blinking into camera flashes, the weight of victory sinking in, compensatory damages for my barn's historic worth, punitive damages to sting the HOA into next year, a total that could bankrupt them if their insurer dodged the tab. "Mr. Driscoll, is this the end of the Willow Peak HOA?" a reporter shouted. I kept it steady. "Nothing brings back my family's barn, but this says property rights aren't a punching bag for petty preferences." Shannon squeezed my hand, her eyes bright with pride and leftover tears. Virginia stumbled out, face gray, avoiding the press as board members whispered in a frantic huddle. The number was staggering, high enough to make them sweat, and I knew she'd underestimated the fire she'd lit when she raised my great-grandfather's legacy. The HOA scrambled post-verdict, rumors flying that their insurance balked at covering punitive damages tied to malice. Virginia's email had torched their defense. She resigned as president days later, pressure from furious members crushing her grip. They appealed, but the judge swatted it down, the evidence too ironclad. To pay, the HOA raided reserves, hiked assessments on grumbling homeowners, and sold off assets. A community center shed some landscaping gear, while infighting gutted the board. 3 resigned, others faced censure as headlines screamed, "HOA Karen's hubris sparks bankruptcy scare." Virginia sold her house at a loss, fleeing the shame. Whispers said she'd landed in a condo far off, her reign a smoldering ruin. Residents raged at footing her bill. Some launched a coalition to dissolve the HOA entirely, fed up with its dictatorial ghost. My win wasn't just mine. It cracked their fear, letting others breathe freer on their own land. I funneled the payout into rebuilding, not the old barn, impossible to resurrect, but something new on its footprint. Driscoll Hall, I called it, a nod to our lineage, blending fresh beams with salvaged timbers from the wreckage. Shannon and I stood at the site one afternoon, watching the crew hoist wood, the sun gilding the work. "We did what your dad would have," she said, arm looped in mine. "Stood up." I touched an old beam, its grain rough under my fingers, and nodded. Closure wasn't the barn, but this fight, this justice. The new structure wouldn't echo the original's rustic creak, but I carved out a corner for a mini-museum. Faded photos, a plaque about 1925, a tale of its end by HOA hands. Neighbors pitched in historical shots, artifacts, turning it into a community touchstone. A local historian helped craft an exhibit, tracing Willow Peak from farmland to sprawl, my barn a lost star. The press lingered, dubbing me the guy who sued an HOA Karen into oblivion, but it wasn't about fame. It was about that line in the sand. Some asked if I regretted the hard road, the cost to neighbors now paying assessments. I pictured the barn's rubble, Virginia's smug safety lie, and shook my head. Letting it slide would have betrayed my ancestors, my home, the principle of what's mine. Justice demanded a fight, and I'd given it everything. Driscoll Hall rose steady, a symbol not of loss, but of grit. of a stand that broke a bully's back and reminded Willow Peak that power unchecked doesn't own us. Virginia thought she'd bulldoze me quiet. Instead, she'd handed me a megaphone, and the echo was louder than she'd ever dreamed. Driscoll Hall took shape as summer crept into Willow Peak, its fresh beams rising where my great-grandfather's barn once stood, a phoenix of sorts, born from the ashes Virginia Hamilton left behind. I, Martin Driscoll, watched the crew hammer salvaged timbers into the frame, a bittersweet ache in my chest. The HOA's collapse rippled on, Virginia gone, her house sold, the board a fractured shell scrambling to pay my damages. Their insurer ducked the punitive chunk, citing her malice, so assessments spiked, reserves bled dry, and assets vanished. Residents seethed, some pushing to disband the HOA entirely, their anger a chorus I hadn't expected but understood. My win had cost them, sure, but it also broke a yoke. Virginia's petty empire was dust, and folks exhaled freer for it. The press still buzzed. HOA Karen's downfall, a local legend, but I kept my focus on the rebuild, on turning rubble into something lasting. The hall wasn't just a barn redux. It was a statement, a community pivot. The mini-museum corner grew, old planks mounted on the wall, black and white photos of the 1925 original, a plaque detailing its rise and HOA-ordered fall. Neighbors chipped in. Miss Penrose from the Historical Society donated a grainy postcard of the barn in its prime. The history teacher brought a student sketch from a long-ago field trip. I added my dad's deed, a quiet anchor to our claim. Shannon and I hosted a Saturday gathering to christen it. Hot dogs on the grill, tables dotting the lawn, kids darting through the orchard. Even a few ex-HOA stragglers showed, sheepish, mumbling apologies for Virginia's spiral. No grudge, I told them, just against the tyranny that trashed what mattered. The sun dipped, painting the half-built hall gold, and I felt it. Closure wasn't the old barn back, but this, a space to heal and remember. Willow Peak shifted under the verdict's weight. Yards sprouted quirks, unmowed patches, a loud purple mailbox freed from Virginia's beige grip. A new coalition formed not to rule but to connect, hosting potlucks instead of patrols. Some asked if I'd lead it. I waved them off. My fight was done, my point made. Driscoll Hall became a hub, a barn dance planned, a farmer's market penciled in, a neighbor's daughter eyeing it for her wedding. The museum corner drew curious eyes, kids asking, "Why?" They tear it down. I'd crouch steady and say, "They thought they could till we proved they couldn't." Their nods, wide-eyed, felt like seeds, future fighters maybe. Rumors swirled about Virginia, new state, new HOA try, shot down fast by wary neighbors who'd read her saga. She'd gambled on my silence and lost everything. I'd gambled on justice and won more than money. Standing by the hall's frame, Shannon at my side, I traced an old beam's scars, survivors of the backhoe's bite. The wind carried orchard blooms and sawdust, a blend of past and now. "Your great-granddad would have loved this," she said, voice soft. I nodded, mist in my eyes. He'd built to endure, and I'd fought to honor that. Regret. Some nudged me about it, the HOA's mess, neighbors' bills, but picturing that wreckage, Virginia's billing me for her crime, I knew I'd do it again. Letting her win would have buried more than would. It'd have buried principle. Driscoll Hall wasn't the barn, but it was ours. A stand turned into a space, a middle finger to bullies that bloomed into community. Virginia's recklessness had boomeranged, and I'd turned her rubble into roots, proving justice could rebuild what arrogance tore down. Driscoll Hall stood nearly complete by late summer, its new beams laced with the old barn's salvaged timbers, a bridge between what was and what could be. I, Martin Driscoll, watched it rise on the land Virginia Hamilton's crew had scarred, her defeat still rippling through Willow Peak. The HOA was a husk, board gutted, funds drained to pay my damages, residents bristling under assessments they blamed on her hubris. Their insurer's refusal to cover punitive damages, tied to that damning, "Don't worry about consent" email, had forced asset sales and bitter infighting. A coalition bloomed in its place, not to dictate but to unite, and folks let their yards run free, wildflowers, odd sculptures, a defiance Virginia's beige rain never allowed. She'd vanished, her house flipped cheap, whispers placing her in a condo far off, her legacy a cautionary tale in local lore. My fight had unshackled us, and the hall was its monument. Inside, the mini-museum took root, old boards framed with faded photos, a plaque tracing the barn from 1925 to its HOA-ordered end. Neighbors enriched it, a postcard from Miss Penrose, a kid's drawing from the history teacher, my dad's deed under glass. It drew eyes, school groups, curious locals, and I'd guide them, pointing out the original timbers, recounting the fight. "Why'd they do it?" kids asked. "Thought they owned everything," I'd say, till we showed 'em different. Driscoll Hall hummed with life. A barn dance packed the floor, a farmer's market spilled onto the lawn, a wedding booked for fall. Shannon and I hosted a thank you night, grills smoking, orchard alive with kids' laughter, ex-HOA folks there too, heads low. "We didn't see her coming," one said. "No hard feelings," I replied, "just glad it's over." The hall wasn't the barn, but it held its spirit, a space reclaimed, not lost. Willow Peak felt lighter, looser. Porches sagged with quirky decor, lawns shrugged off perfection, a purple mailbox here, a gnome army there. The coalition threw potlucks, not fines, and new voices stepped up, gentler, focused on real needs, potholes, not paint codes. Some nudged me for advice. "HOA's threatening my shed, what now?" "Document it, know your rights, fight if you must," I'd say. "Bullies bank on fear, don't give it." Virginia's shadow faded. Rumors of her flopping at a new HOA elsewhere made us grin she'd misjudged Willow Peak's spine. The press still circled, dubbing me the guy who toppled an HOA Karen. But it wasn't glory I wanted, it was this, a community breathing, not bowing. Driscoll Hall was proof. Justice didn't just punish, it built, turning her wreckage into our gain. Evening found me and Shannon by the hall, sun dipping behind the hills, fresh lumber scent mingling with orchard blooms. I traced a salvaged beam, its knots a map of survival. "Your great-granddad's smiling," she said, arm in mine. I nodded, throat tight. He'd crafted endurance, and I'd fought to keep it alive. "Regret?" some asked. The HOA's ruin hit neighbors' wallets, but picturing that half-torn barn, Virginia's $14,000 bill for a crime, I stood firm. Surrender would have betrayed more than would. It'd have buried our roots. Driscoll Hall rose taller, not the past reborn, but a future forged. A stand against tyranny that grew into a gathering place. Virginia thought she'd crush me. Instead, she handed me a torch, and Willow Peak lit up brighter, freer, because I dared to swing back. Fall painted Willow Peak in golds and reds, and Driscoll Hall stood finished, its hybrid frame of new and salvaged wood a quiet triumph over Virginia Hamilton's reckless swing. I, Martin Driscoll, watched it settle into the land, a new heartbeat where my great-grandfather's barn once thrummed. The HOA was a ghost. Virginia's exit left it bankrupt, its remnants dissolved by a fed-up coalition of residents who'd rather grill than grovel. Assessments had stung, sure, but they'd bought freedom. Yards now bristled with wild edges, unkempt hedges, a tie-dye birdhouse, proof her beige chokehold was dead. She'd slunk off, condo-bound, her name a punchline in headlines like HOA Karen's Folly Fuels Small-Town Revolt. My fight had toppled her, but it had done more. Cracked open a community that'd been suffocating under her thumb, letting it bloom messy and true. Driscoll Hall became our anchor. The mini-museum glowed inside, salvaged planks on display, photos of the 1925 barn, a plaque etching its rise and fall by HOA hands. Neighbors kept it alive. Miss Penrose's postcards, the teacher's field trip tailies, my dad's deed a silent sentinel. School kids traipsed through wide-eyed. I'd point to the old timbers, saying, "This stood a century till someone overstepped. We fixed that." It hosted life now, barn dances with fiddles wailing, farmers' markets spilling produce, a wedding where vows echoed off the beams. Shannon and I threw a harvest night, tables groaning with pie, orchard lit by lanterns, ex-HOA holdouts mingling, chastened. "We let her run wild," one admitted. "You stopped her," I shrugged. "Had to lost too much not to." The hall wasn't the barn, but it carried its soul, a space reborn from rubble, ours by right and fight. Willow Peak shed its old skin. Lawns grew shaggy or stayed neat by choice. A kid down the street built a tire swing unpoliced. The coalition swapped rules for roots, potlucks, a tool share, real talk over fences. Folks asked my take on HOA scraps elsewhere. "They're finding my porch help." "Proof up, stand firm," I'd say. "They crumble when you don't." Virginia's echo was faint, rumors of her flailing in some new town, rebuffed by wary souls who'd Googled her past. The press dubbed me barn guy, but I waved off the spotlight. Driscoll Hall was the story, a testament to grit over greed. It drew strangers too, snapping pics, asking why it mattered. "Because it was ours," I'd tell them, "and no one gets to steal that unpunished." The fights cost neighbors' wallets, my sleepless nights faded against what we'd gained, a place unbound, alive. By the hall one dusk, Shannon and I lingered, wind rustling the orchard, fresh-cut wood scent sharp. I gripped a salvaged beam, its scars a map of endurance. "Your dad's proud," she murmured, hand in mine. I nodded, eyes stinging. He'd built for keeps, and I'd battled to honor it. Regret. Some hinted at it, the HOA's fall shook things, but Virginia's $14,000 invoice, her smug, hazard lie, burned brighter. Backing down would have buried our legacy, not just boards. Driscoll Hall stood taller. A middle finger to her tyranny turned into a handshake for us all. She'd swung to crush me. I'd swung back, and Willow Peak rose freer, fiercer from her dust. Justice wasn't the barn remade. It was this. A community stitched from defiance, rooted deep because I'd refused to let her win. Winter dusted Willow Peak with a light frost, and Driscoll Hall stood solid. Its blend of new lumber and salvaged timbers a quiet monument to what I, Martin Driscoll, had fought for. Virginia Hamilton's reign was a memory. Her HOA dissolved, bankrupted by the damages I'd won, her name a fatting sneer in tailies of that barn guy who took her down. Residents had paid a price, assessments biting deep, but they'd traded cash for liberty. Yards now sprawled with unscripted life, wild grasses, a wonky scarecrow, a kid's fort of scrap wood. She'd fled, condo-bound, her legacy of control undone by a community that found its spine. The hall was our proof, not just a rebuild, but a rebirth, a middle finger to her arrogance that grew into a cornerstone for us all. Inside, the mini-museum thrived, old beams mounted, photos of the 1925 barn framed, a plaque telling its tale from my great-grandfather's hands to its HOA-ordered ruin. Neighbors kept it rich. Miss Penrose's artifacts, the teacher's sketches, my dad's deed under glass. It drew crowds, school tour locals, strangers snapping pics, and I'd guide them tracing the salvaged wood. "Why, they wreck it?" kids asked. "Thought they could bully us," I'd say, till we fought back. Driscoll Hall pulsed with purpose. Barn dances spun into spring, markets buzzed, a wedding's laughter rang off the rafters. Shannon and I hosted a winter gathering, cider simmering, orchard bare but alive with kids' shrieks, ex-HOA shadows there too, humbled. "You saved us from her," one muttered. "Saved myself first," I said, but glad it spread. The hall wasn't the barn, but it held its heart, a legacy reclaimed, not erased. Willow Peak wore its freedom loud. Porches creaked with odd treasures, lawns defied the clipper, the coalition built bridges, swap meets, a book club, not barricades. Folks sought my counsel, HOAs after my fence tips. Evidence guts push back, I'd tell them. They fold when you stand. Virginia's ghost was a laugh, tailies of her flopping elsewhere, shunned by neighbors wise to her past. The press pegged me HOA slayer, but Driscoll Hall stole the show. A stand turned sanctuary, proof justice could root deeper than vengeance. Visitors asked its worth, I'd nod to the beams. "It's ours, someone tried to steal it, and we won it back." The fight's toll, money, tension paled next to what rose, a community unbound, fierce and free. One rainy dusk, Shannon and I stood in the hall's loft, drops tapping the glass. I ran a hand over an old timber, its grain a whisper of 1925. "Your great-granddad's here," she said, arm looped in mine. I nodded, throat tight. He'd built to last, and I'd fought to prove it. Regret, some murmured, the HOA's fall shook wallets, but Virginia's smug invoice, her wrecking crew, burned clearer. Folding would have buried our soul, not just wood. Driscoll Hall was more, a defiance that bloomed into belonging, a middle finger flipped into a foundation. She'd swung to break me. I'd swung harder, and Willow Peak shone brighter for it. Justice wasn't the barn reborn, it was this. Roots reclaimed, a community forged from grit, a legacy no bully could touch. Virginia misjudged me, and her rubble built our rise, stronger, truer ours.